sleep off for lunch as we go through this. A bit of housekeeping. I'm probably going to jump around a bit, because I've been on a long flight to get here and I'm feeling a bit restless. I came from London over the Atlantic. Took me way too long. But I can't actually reach my computer from the console because the cable's too short, which for a technology company is a bit embarrassing, but I won't dwell on that. So my name is Dominic Thazaratha, and at Autodesk I am responsible for thought leadership for the global construction and natural resource industries, which basically means I spend my time looking out over the next 10 years and asking that question, what is it that's shaping those industries? How are they going to change? And therefore, what do we need to do to have products and services, consulting and counsel to help the construction industry as it reacts to the changes that are happening? So this topic of BIM and global megatrends, it's a big and chunky topic. It's got significant implications for you as industry professionals in construction, for the companies that you work for, and ultimately for your industry. And I think it's fair to say that to do it justice in the space of an hour or however long we can take to go through this is probably not going to do it the level of justice that you need to, but hopefully it will give you some ideas for food for thought about what it is, the big ticket items that are shaping the industry going forwards. So I think it's fair to say that much of the focus on BIM to date has been around its role in supporting efficient, productive delivery of projects. And certainly when I meet with customers as I bump around the world, 9 times out of 10 the conversation is around improving a process. How are we improving clash detection? How are we reducing waste? Look at the stuff we're doing with 4D and 5D BIM, etc. But increasingly I'm finding, certainly at the executive level, I'm being asked a slightly different set of questions. How can BIM help me react better to some of the key industry issues as the industry is changing? How can it help me deal with issues around, for example, knowledge attrition? As we've got an aging population within the construction industry, when that chap who's the expert in rotating equipment for the last 30 years collects his Rolex and goes fishing in Australia, what happens with that knowledge as it walks out of the door? Can BIM help me with things like that? Can it help me lay off material-related risk? Or how can it help me compete better and smarter in the lean economic times that we continually seem to be in over the last few years? So what I'd like to do is to shine a spotlight onto some of those issues and share some thoughts with you around what we're seeing is shaping the construction industry now and over the next few years from these things that we're calling megatrends. Now, is anyone not familiar with the phrase megatrend? Okay, so I'll give you a definition for the scope of this presentation. A megatrend is something that is multi-year in length, and it's something that affects more than one industry. So it impacts multiple industries. And it impacts them in such a way that it fundamentally can change the nature of that industry, in the way that it works, in the business models that exist, and potentially opening up new opportunities. Turn my flicker on. So what we're going to cover is, first of all, what are the key global megatrends that we're seeing that we think are going to be most overweight in terms of shaping the future of the construction industry. They are all here today and are already shaping the industry, but they will continue to shape it in an accelerated fashion over the next few years. We're going to look at what it is that's fundamentally driving them. We're going to get under the hood, because by understanding that, it's going to help us to prepare for the changes that we anticipate will happen in the industry. The second thing we're going to do is then to look at what are the implications for the Aec sector in general, and then later for construction specifically. If we think about the way that Aec runs today, current market practices, what do we see going forwards as the risks, the challenges and the opportunities as these big ticket trends, these fundamentally game-changing trends take hold or accelerate across the industry? And then based on that, how do we think construction is likely to react? Given the way that we know construction behaves today, as it were, what your operating models are, what your strategies are, how the industry performs. If this change is coming along, what do we think that means for your strategies as construction professionals, as owners of construction companies? Will you take an offensive stance, or will you take a defensive stance as these big trends wash over us? So I'll kick off, I guess, by saying that it's probably no surprise that we live in a world of constant, rapidly accelerating change. And one of the difficult things to do is to pick out of all of this noise that's going on, all of this change that we're seeing, whether it's technology, whether it's people, whatever it is, which of those things are trends and which of them are actually background noise? And then of those trends, which ones should you prioritize? Which do you think are probably going to have the most impact on your business, on your industry going forwards? Well, to save you the trouble, over the last few months, something I've done with my peers is run through this process, and we've had a stab at a guess at what we think in terms of talking with construction executives globally are the most important global megatrends that will shape construction. And essentially it boils down to just 4 little trends. And each of those trends has 3 sub-trends. So it gives you a nice round dozen trends to have a think about. The first one is this notion of macroeconomic change. So think finance, think industry, think geopolitics, all of the big ticket stuff that's going on. And how will changes in the global economy, its form, its function, its successes, its failures, how will they shape the way that construction performs and shape the construction industry over the next few years? Probably comes as no surprise to you that in the executives that I speak to, this is their number one concern. Ever since 2008, since we had the global financial crisis and the game changer that was, certainly for the medium term around global finance, what are the issues that we see coming out of this in terms of how construction will change going forwards, and potentially what the role of technology and technology-enabled processes like BIM will be. The second trend, megatrend, is about people. Shifting demographics. What are the people of tomorrow? We know we rapidly accelerated past the 7 billion headcount mark globally, and that trend is going in only one direction. But the dynamics, the demographics of populations are changing. We have youthful nations, we have aging populations in other nations. We have this whole question about the new Millennial Generation, the Generation Z that's grown up knowing nothing but digital technology. They are the future of your industry. And the older members of that generation will be coming into the workforce in your sector pretty quickly. What do we need to know about the way that they think, about the way that they collaborate, about the way that they approach work in terms of how that's likely to change the industry? Our third trend is probably the one most aligned with construction, and it is this issue of the infrastructure challenge. Globally, over the next, I think it's 30 or 35 years, the world has to spend $70 trillion on infrastructure. Part of that is a refresh. You just have a look around you at some of the infrastructure you have here in the US and some of the infrastructure we have in Northern Europe. And we know that this stuff is end of life, post-end of life, it needs to be replaced. But a lot of it is new, is greenfield stuff, as particularly the emerging economies continue to head towards developed nation status. To do that, they need economic infrastructure in place, highways, railways, etc., and social infrastructure, schools, hospitals, everything else, housing. $70 trillion. Currently projected funding is only at $50 trillion, so a $20 trillion black hole. Big issue, big trend there that's going to face the construction industry over the next few years. And our final one is probably the one that's closest to what we do, is this issue around data, technology, and the whole social collaboration issue. So how do you see the world moving beyond this obsession almost with data and turning data into useful information and useful information into knowledge, and this whole notion of the knowledge economy and knowledge workers? And how do we see this significantly changing the way the construction industry performs and changing construction strategies going forwards? So for each of these 4 megatrends, we've identified within each of these 3 sub-trends. It gives you a nice round dozen, and I'm going to run through each of these megatrends and their sub-trends now. So let's start off with the most pressing one, macroeconomic change. I guess if you speak with any economist and you ask them for a prediction of the future, what's happening with global finance, you will get a different response from each and every one of them. But the one thing that they are certainly do seem to be in agreement with is that for the next few years we are in this medium-term period of a lot of uncertainty in global finance. And certainly access to finance is becoming trickier than it used to be pre-2008. You have, I guess to sum it up, the combination of the developed world, which is highly indebted by and large. Hands up, anybody from Australia or Norway? Fantastic. So this probably doesn't affect you guys as much as the rest of us. But generally, they're carrying a lot of sovereign debt. And the implications for that are quite profound. If you look at, for example, here in the US, we are now in the third round of quantitative easing. We have issues around, look what's going on in the Eurozone with Greece, with Spain, with Italy, with Ireland. Even back in the UK, we also have quantitative easing. So big issues around accessing finance and a lack of finance. If you think about what's going on in the private sector seems to have two aspects to it. The first is borrowing money from banks, we know, is more difficult than it used to be, and that's not going to change anytime soon. We are in a continual period of constrained debt. So raising money for things like project finance is more difficult now than it used to be. And that applies right across the board, from the big mega projects right down to the little guys who are doing the home renovations. If you think about the traditional mechanism for example, big capital projects, we know that construction debt, by and large, isn't investment grade because construction is a risky business. Generally, statistically, 50% of projects either bust their schedule or bust their budget. Because of that, construction debt isn't investment grade, and because of that, accessing finance can be difficult. You can't go to a pension fund and say, buy my uninvestment grade debt, because they have a duty of care to their community. They can't do that. So traditionally, the way of getting around that was, of course, the monoline insurers would put their arms around your debt and give it that respectable credit rating, and then it could be sold on. Well, ever since the demise of the credit rating for many of the monolines back in 2008, it makes it much more difficult to raise that kind of debt. But it also applies to operational finance, so things like issuing commercial paper. Those of you that just go out and issue paper to raise finance for running your payroll and basic things. Right across the board in the private bank-driven lending, we're seeing a lot of issues around getting access to finance. And that's not going to change anytime soon. The irony is that there is also a lot of money around in other aspects of private finance. For example, private equity, hedge funds, and in particular sovereign wealth. All have a lot of cash, but tapping that can be quite tricky. And the implications that we're seeing for the Aec sector is this whole landscape for funding of both projects and operations for both owners and contractors has changed. And it's likely to remain changed for the next few years until there's a lot of cash flowing again, until people are prepared to spend and change their minds. So those companies that have cash tend to be hoarding it. And getting access to finance means perhaps looking for alternative sources. And what are the implications for alternative sources? Well, what we're starting to see, and certainly when I'm speaking with executives for both owners and contractors, is this notion of finance is increasingly linked to project surety. So the lower you can make your risk profile of your project or of your operations, the more chance you've got of getting access to finance, and that finance on more favourable terms. So if you stop and you think about that, and you think and ask that question, well, where can BIM fit into that picture? Well, we know that the BIM-based process upholds accurate, complete and timely information. It gives you the potential to deliver projects in a world, in theory, of perfect information, a repeatable play with a greater surety of outcome. And now we're starting to see funding of projects, particularly from the private sector around PPP projects, looking for contractors and partners and project teams that are using BIM, because it gives them a greater sense of surety that what they'll get in terms of the project deliverable will be on target. So the second aspect, the second sub-trend to this megatrend of macroeconomic change is this issue of increased volatility in commodities. Everybody probably is aware of the commodities supercycle. Kind of ran for 10 years, starting at around 2000, still sort of running but taking a bit of a breath, where everything from the price of thermal coal to iron ore went on a steady upwards trajectory. Things have kind of changed a bit now. You talk with primary producers and you ask them, what's going to happen over the next 10 years? And the response, by and large, seems to be prices are going to go up, but there will be a significant whipsaw action in the price. If you think about what the implications are for that, it's introducing a lot of volatility into the price of the materials that you buy. But it's not just the price of the materials, it's also access to materials. We know that there are finite reserves of iron ore, for example. Over the long term, over the next few years, will we see protectionism moving into access to materials? And for any of you that think, well, maybe that's a bit far-fetched, I'll probably remind you of the energy protectionism that occurred back in the 1970s, the whole oil crisis. Is it too far-fetched to think that we won't have the same thing around iron, around magnesium, around copper, around any of the other basic materials that are needed for construction? So the expected change that we're seeing in practice is in these three areas. Yes, there's pressure to reduce material waste. And that's always been there, but here's an added incentive to do this. Reduce your exposure to that volatility. Improve the visibility of your supply chain so you can see, are you going to get that product at the price you need it for the right time? Can you gain better control? Can you de-risk that? And how can you lay off material-related risk? How can you actually maybe sidestep things like price volatility? Are any of you practicing material hedging? Use of derivatives, options, the steel, copper, anything like that? Very useful way to be able to lock in price. And a lot of your peers are now looking at doing this. If you look at, for example, the London Metal Exchange, the Chicago Mercantile, you'll see that there has actually been an explosion in the uptake of steel billet futures contracts. Steel billet, intermediate product for rebar, of course. Ask yourself who's buying those. Who is using that sophisticated method to lay off risk for price volatility that they're seeing coming from this megatrend. Of course, if you want to play in that way, you need accurate, complete, and timely information. And again, of course, those of you that are using BIM for 3D, 4D, and 5D are able to get that information and start to play in this fashion to help you hedge the risk of this increased volatility that we're seeing in input prices. So our third sub-trend of the megatrend of macroeconomic change is probably the biggest, changing economic hegemony. In short, the world is going to become a much more crowded place in terms of the number of developed nations. You've probably heard the phrase BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, China. You may have heard the phrase CIVET, Colombia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Egypt, Turkey, South Africa. Over the next 15 years, all of those economies are developing further. And within the next 15 years, it's projected that each of the BRIC countries will be the largest economies. They will be the major economies. As those economies develop, so do their industries. And that means more competition for you. What does that look like? Well, if you look at, for example, what's happened in China, as GDP growth has slowed down in China, all those contractors that were very busy building Chinese infrastructure are now becoming export-focused. And you've no doubt started to see a lot of Chinese contractors are now looking to export capabilities into Europe, into North America. And some US contractors got quite a surprise when they went up against Chinese contractors for the Rio contracts, for the Olympics in 2016. Think about what that might mean for you in a world where there are a lot of sophisticated players. And that sophistication is coming in two forms. The first is in price point competition, those that are able to cut the price of their operations and compete purely on price, and those that are value-driven, those that are able to offer more of a relationship-based, whole-life view of customers' assets and look at value-add services. 15 years is the longest period I have seen, longest quote, in terms of each of those four major nations becoming the leading economies of the world. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Let's talk about people. People issues. What are our three sub-trends here? The first is this whole nature of shifting population ages. We know in the developed world, by and large, we have an aging population. The median age is creeping up, a lot of grey hairs. We know, by and large, in the emerging world, we have a younger population for the time being. If you look, there's now a lot of concern in countries like China, for example, that they are, because of their one-child policy, going to have issues going forwards in terms of more of a growing population. But what does that mean? What's the impact going to mean? Well, it's going to mean, how do you ensure that you have the right number of workers? How do you ensure you have a suitable pipeline of talent that you can actually deliver on the business that you're going after? And what we're expecting to see is this transformation of the skills landscape. We're with much more of a global worker in construction, a very uniform approach to how projects are delivered. And we're already starting to see this in countries where there are skills shortages. Australia is a good example of overseas talent being brought in to fill the gaps simply because there just aren't enough people locally that have either chosen construction as a career or that the age is young enough. What we're starting to see in terms of changes in practice focus are these three things. A greater emphasis for the use of technology on worker productivity. So things like BIM, can you start to build more processes into BIM so you're not so dependent on having somebody to have it do it manually? How can you use things like BIM as a platform to transfer knowledge? So to train up the next generation, to train up workers from different industry sectors to move into your industry quickly. Can you use it as a platform for learning? And then finally, this issue of new creative training programs. One of the challenges the industry faces is it is considered a sunset industry by many young people, particularly in the younger end of Generation Y. They all want to become pop stars or what have you and famous, etc. And it can be quite difficult to encourage somebody to move into what they consider to be a sunset industry. And one of the great ways that technology can help is all the flash, whizzy stuff that we do from a video and a graphically driven concept. So you've got a generation that's grown up knowing video games and interaction, all this very fast type of technology. And we're starting to see that alignment of technology with the construction industry now. And it can be a very attractive proposition in terms of helping you to build that pipeline with the next generation. So our second sub-trend in the megatrend of shifting demographics is this notion of urbanization and the rise of the middle classes. The whole number of megacities you've probably heard is going to go up. I think we're due in the next 10 years, 30 megacities of over 10 million, which don't exist today, and a whole bunch of other smaller cities that come on top of that. Many of you would have seen earlier this year there was an interesting news article that said now 51% of the Chinese population are urban dwellers. So they've reached that tipping point already. Now, of course, everybody that lives in a city needs access to housing, needs access to infrastructure, clean water, power, etc., etc. Big implications. And one of those is that our urban environments are becoming increasingly complex and very difficult to manage. It can be done by humans alone, of course. But if you send out a crew to fix a burst water main at an intersection and he happens to go through a T1 line that's serving the lawyer's office telco on the corner, you know you're going to get hit with a lawsuit. Far better to look at how you can leverage this whole notion of model-based management at the city level. So everyone's familiar with the phrase BIM. We also have this alternate phrase BAM, which is Big Ass Model, which essentially is a city-level model, fed from a lot of individual BIM models of assets. But this ability to be able to build the whole urban environment within a model-based context and allow you to manage the urban environment better and more efficiently than you can do, more cost-effectively than you can do, more productively than you can do with just human endeavor alone. So our third sub-trend in this shifting demographics is this notion of what do we do with this millennial generation? Millennial generation, by definition, or Generation Z, one that came after Y, are the children that were born from around 1998 onwards. And they have grown up, the first generation that's grown up as being digitally native. And that means for them, there are no such things, for example, as a digital camera when they pick up just a camera, because unlike you and I, they don't remember the days of silver nitrate film where you used to have to go down to the pharmacist, drop off your roll of film, wait a week, and then be disappointed with the results afterwards. For them, everything is instant. And we know that that generation is growing up with a unique set of behaviours. They're very collaborative. They're very interactive. They do things like working together in a very highly crowd context. They have a short attention span. They're very graphically driven. What do you need to do to accommodate that type of behaviour? And recognising that that's a very homogenous generation. So whether it's youngsters in the US or in the UK or in Australia or in China, they've all been immersed in this digital way of thinking and this digital interaction with the world. They are the future of your industry. What can they bring to you? But equally, what do you need to do to excite them and to get them to choose construction as a career? Okay, our third megatrend, the whole infrastructure challenge. I've labelled it 1.0 and 2.0 for obvious reasons. There is expansion as the emerging economies, the BRIC and the CIVETS countries, continue to accelerate, continue to develop their economies. They need the infrastructure, both economic and social, in place to meet that. And there's the refreshed challenge that we have of end of life and post-life in much of the developed world. $70 trillion. It is an absolutely huge opportunity. It's a mega market, a generational opportunity, because once those nations that are developing have developed, it will be gone. How can you position yourself for success? And how can you ride this wave here? I've put it AEC rebranding as capital infrastructure. So this whole slightly dodgy phrase of the answer is yes, what's the question? When customers say, how can you help me? Here's my challenge. I need to build in an extra 700 megawatts equivalent of generating capacity. Is that one power station, or is it 2, 3, 50 megawatt power stations? How can you help me, Mr. Construction Industry? Expected changes that we're seeing is an increasing use of technology in decision support. What is the right mix of generation for that power station that I need? What are the implications for operations and maintenance? What's my CapEx, OpEx split? Making all those decisions in an appropriate and a timely manner with the huge amount of information that's needed is really becoming unfeasible for humans to do alone. Far better to look at how you can leverage, certainly in a model-based environment, which is information-rich, to help you make those decisions. A second sub-trend in this whole infrastructure issue is this perversion of harmony with nature, the sustainability issue. And I'm probably the worst person in the world to stand here and talk about this, because I spent the best part of 20 years building oil refineries, and all they did is colour the sky nicely, give you a better coloured sunset from the emissions that they did. But it is this notion of increasingly there are additional pressures being layered on the construction industry to jump to it and get with the whole sustainability agenda of you've got to be green across everything. And this is coming from multiple areas. It's coming from legislation. So you look at the whole carbon tax. Many countries, I think Australia is probably one of the most recent ones that's got a carbon tax. But it's also coming from corporate social responsibility. A lot of pressure from shareholders, from stakeholders to be green. And this is a new kind of area, and it's not without its risks. In the European Union, we rushed into putting in a carbon tax, and that hit steel production quite badly, because any EU-produced steel is hit with a carbon tax. Not so if it's shipped in from outside. Some quite serious implications there, if you think about it, for locally produced steel, local steel industries. So what we're starting to see in terms of technology reacting to that is this notion of BIM being a platform for sustainability, helping you to manage that whole, minimizing the impact that your projects, that your work, that your assets have on the environment, giving back as much as possible, and meeting your obligations from a legal and CSR perspective, but also potentially exploiting new opportunities. Can you set up in green consulting, for example, taking in BIM models and providing that kind of analysis as a value-add service? So our final sub-trend in the infrastructure challenge is this notion of market liberalisation. Now, anyone that's from any of the major developed economies, this probably is nothing new. This is the notion of major public sector, particularly infrastructure, moving into the hands of the private sector. So being liberalised and taking that old way of working, where perhaps asset performance and asset optimization wasn't necessarily the main focus. It was more provision of service, and looking at what happens when it's actually funded by the private sector, through private equity, through vehicles such as PPP, etc. What are the implications for that? Well, significant pressure to improve asset performance. So really looking at maximizing the return on investment when the ownership changes hands from being publicly funded to privately funded. And this notion of upskilling a workforce. How do you en masse change perhaps a public sector utility workforce and switch them over to serving in a private sector manner, where profit ultimately is the end game as opposed to perhaps provision of service? Well, what we're starting to see coming in certain utility companies is this notion of how can BIM be used for whole life management of assets and constraint-based management of assets. Constraint-based being, here is my constraint. I don't want this to cost more than X. Or I don't want my maintenance run rate to be more than Y. Or I don't want the carbon output of this facility to be more than Z, or whatever it might be. How can we use BIM to help us make those decisions? And going forwards, we're certainly probably going to see a greater use of technology and technology-enabled processes like BIM to help make those decisions. Okay, on to our final megatrend, this one which is probably the one that resonates most with us here at Autodesk. It's this notion of data and technology and social and all those good things that are happening. And the first here is this notion of data fusion. There's a lot of data out there. 2009, I think it was. In 2009, more data, more new data was created than in the entire history of mankind up until that point. By 2020, the volume of data is predicted to increase. It's predicted to double every 72 hours. How do you cope with that much data that's being created? How can you bring it together and turn it into something useful? At the same time, how do you react to this whole notion of social connectivity? We are and we always will be very geographically dispersed. But today, through technology, everybody's much closer. It's quite scary when you go onto things like LinkedIn and recommendations pop up from people that you kind of left in the past 10, 15 years ago and you kind of wish they'd stayed there. But that's a reflection of the way that we're all much closer together these days. We are much more connected. What are the implications for that, for your industry going forwards? This trend of ubiquitous communication, being able to take, whether it's one of these or whether it's a laptop, whatever device it is, and being able to do anything with it, anywhere, anytime, accessing not just your information, but your functionality. How do you see that changing the way that you work and changing the way that your companies operate? And then moving into the cloud, this notion of having access to infinite computing. Has everybody here heard of Moore's Law? Yeah, so Moore's Law is this whole notion of computing power doubles, I think, every 18 months, whatever it is. So you know that this time in a year and a half, you'll have a processor that's twice as powerful that you can go and buy. Well, infinite computing actually sidesteps that, if you think about it. Because infinite computing gives you access to an unlimited, in theory, amount of computing in the cloud that you can tap into. So whereas before you may have been restricted in the work that you're doing in things like BIM by how much RAM you can cram into a particular desktop or how many processors you can fit in. Now through this notion of infinite computing through the cloud, you can potentially tap into thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of processors, of memory, etc. What might that do in terms of changing what you do with modeling and with helping you to run your businesses? So the impact that we're starting to see, and which will accelerate on the Aec sector, is firstly this notion of everything's going to be far more connected. We've got iPhones, we've got iPods, we've got iTVs, we'll probably have everything. Yes, your fridge will automatically talk to your power company and renegotiate its unit rate to a lower tariff automatically. You think that's too far-fetched? 10 years ago, I worked on a major petrochemicals project where we did just that. Summing up in real time our usage because it was very high for electricity and going out and polling the market on a half-hourly basis to get a better result, to get a lower unit rate. What do you think the implications of that might be for your industry where you can get that real-time connection where everything is wired together? How is the construction industry going to deal with this challenge of so much information? We know that oceans are more powerful than rivers, I think the phrase is, but you're more likely to drown in an ocean than you are in a river. Really fundamental issue, particularly now as in the olden days when you ran a project, when the project finished, what did you do? You took the stick files, you took all the documents, the vendor prints, you put them in a bunch of archive boxes and off they went. And that was the last time you saw them. But now this stuff sticks around. It overstays its welcome. And it's hanging around. It's all available. It's accessible. What can you do with that information? What should you do with that information? Can it add value to you after the project is over? After you've met your commitments to your customers? And how do you get value? How do you get dollars and cents value? What processes are out there where you can start quantifying what your information is worth? Can you, for example, sell your information? Another interesting thing that's happening in the resources sector, in the oil and gas sector, is the sale of rotating equipment performance data back to the manufacturers of that equipment, who will pay for it. Just one small example of how the value of information can live on beyond its original purpose. What might that mean for you as an industry? Okay, so the changes in practices that we're expecting are, yes, things are going to become far more integrated. And by integration, I should clarify, I'm not specifically talking about types of CAD files, etc. I'm talking about things coming together from a process perspective, from a business handshaking perspective, with the technology enabling that. Far closer and a far greater emphasis on a reduction in commercial interfaces between companies. So many of you are no doubt working on things like IPD-style contracts, on design build, on EPC, which are the newer type contracts compared to the old design bid build with all of their hard interfaces. Certainly we're starting to see through the technology a stimulus, and coming back from the commercial side, this notion of everybody moving together and reducing that number of commercial interfaces and working far more closely together with the processes flowing, handshaking, and the technology supporting that underneath. This is quite an interesting one, because we all talk about data and we all talk about information, and most of us think of that in the context of spreadsheets, of numbers, of reports, all other quite dry stuff. But the human brain is a pattern recognition engine, and it is stimulated visually. So it's not really geared up to look at long lists of numbers and all that traditional engineering type stuff that we all used to produce in Excel spreadsheets. So increasingly we see, particularly as the volume of information that you need to churn to make decisions increases, we're seeing this notion of how do you visually represent that? How do you turn that into a nice, interesting pattern? If any of you are familiar with some of the stuff that's done in the trading houses, so in the financial services sector, you'll know that they do a lot of turning highly complex information sets into patterns, which traders can visually interpret and say, I can spot that, that's a hot spot, I need to buy some copper or some steel, or put a futures bet on oil, the price of oil or whatever it is, simply because they're churning so much information. And increasingly that is something that you will face in the construction sector. How can you leverage the technology to help you amass that information, process it, and then translate it into a visual medium to float back to you so you can make those decisions? Rise of the robots. Increasingly, coming back to that example earlier of the T1 line at the crossroads, the notion of how can you get technology to take the strain and start building in the automation into it, so it makes the decisions for you. And I know one of the big challenges, for example, that you have right now in things like BIM is if somebody sends you, if you're building a process plant, something in a file and they say that this is a compressor and actually it's a pump, that causes you a problem. Is it unfeasible to think that in the not too distant future technology will be able to say, actually it kind of doesn't look like a compressor, because based on the fluid code that's attached to this, it's really pumping gas, and actually it's not pumping gas, it's pumping a liquid, so it's probably going to be a pump. So to help you make those decisions, to build in and free you from that low-level type of process. Certainly it's something that we're predicting is going to happen, this uptake of automation stepping in there, and at the beginning doing those more manual and menial checking and menial tasks, but then rapidly freeing you to focus on more of the value add. So what I want to finish by going through here is how we see these technology trends really shaping this whole mega trend of the future of project delivery. So bringing it home into construction, what do we think are going to be the things that are really going to change in the way that projects are executed in the construction sector over the next few years, given what's happening with this whole data, social technology thing? Well, the first thing is this notion of high-resolution modeling. And high-resolution modeling is much more than just pretty pictures, although that's quite an impressive picture there. It is the ability to be able to visualize and visually represent information down to whatever level of detail that you need to do the job. But it's much more than that. It's potentially not just representing the geometry so the visual that you can see, but the physics that sits behind that. So, for example, in that picture, what might be the heat loading, the heat output that's happening in that particular facility? How can that help you then model implications for your HVAC, etc.? The second is how this notion of the cloud and infinite computing can help with doing analysis during design. So you know that traditionally, I guess, you did a design, then you analyzed it for its performance, whether it was carbon or energy, whatever it was. It's far more efficient to do that on the fly, isn't it? So if we took this room and we decided it wasn't big enough and we wanted to push it out 10 foot to accommodate another 50 people, wouldn't it be great if you could do that and in real time see the implications on the HVAC loading, see the implications on what your run rate would be if you rented this room out, etc. I think when you have access to an unlimited amount of computing power, it unlocks the potential to be able to do that kind of thing. Immersive environment. So everyone's seen the whole putting the goggles on and walking around stuff. I think we're probably going to see a lot more of this going forwards, but in a much more collaborative way, where people will have virtual big rooms, virtual environments, moving beyond things like telepresence, where you'll be able to collaborate around a particular model, collaborate around a project environment, irrespective of where you are in the world, in a very intuitive way. Construction reality capture. Point clouds, laser scanning, all that stuff is nothing new. One of the restrictions it has today is it's only scanning the geometrical. So you're only getting the 3D stuff that's coming into that. If you follow the stuff that's happening with developments in sensing technology, you'll know that that is accelerating away in terms of the types of things that they can sense for. Sensing for things like heat is obviously quite easy. Sensing for things like radiation, for those of you that are involved in nuclear decommissioning, is another thing that's quite easy. Can you start to build that into your BIM models when you're doing capture of existing facilities? Do you think it's too unfeasible that in the next few years you could have something like this? And I'm not saying it would be a Star Trek type tricorder, but that can sense beyond the physical, that can maybe detect material types, asbestos for remediation type work. I'd encourage anybody that's interested in that to follow some of the work that's been done in remote sensing, because I think, again, there's an opportunity there for it to be a game changer within this trend. Complex perpetual modeling. This picture here is wind flow through a major city. Any of you that have done this will know it's an incredibly compute-intensive thing to do. So before you build that iconic Starkitect designed 50-story funny-shaped apartment block on the corner of 5th and Main, you need to check that the people at the ground aren't going to get blown away by the wind that you create from the corridor when you stick it up. But to do that takes a lot of work, a lot of effort. Now, obviously, with this notion of infinite computing that's being introduced, going forwards, potentially that's something that you can do very quickly and allow you to come up with the right answer by crunching a vast amount of information, all of those numbers, in almost real time and coming up with the best design. And actually, it's not a good idea to put it on that particular corner, knock down the building opposite, and stick it up over there. Perpetual analysis. Has anyone heard of perpetual analysis in the context of construction? How do you design a building today? Who would you say is the best designer? Does the best designer exist in your company? Is it in your competitors? Is it US designers? Is it Chinese designers? Is it Australian designers? Who do you think? Who's the best designer in the world today, if you had to name one? Is it Norman Foster? Is it anybody? You're real contractors, aren't you? There's no architects here. I'd put it to that the best designer in the world today is nature. Can we mimic evolutionary design going forwards? If you think about it, nature has had millions of years to perfect the design process. Nature has to deal with a whole lot of more dimensions than we do as construction professionals. But to mimic the way that nature does evolutionary design takes an awful lot of computing power. But again, if you have this notion of infinite computing, where you can tap in real time in a flexible way to a whole huge amount of computing power to crunch those numbers, can you, for example, start off with two basic designs for a building? You've been commissioned to build a 50-story casino. And you've optimized one for carbon performance, and you've optimized the other for run rate, for OPEX. And you put them together and you breed those two through evolutionary design in a nasty, hard-bid, toxic environment. And you see all the different generations that come out of that. If you use the way that nature does design, that should, in theory, give you the best design that's optimized for all the different environments. And the more environments you throw at it, the more you need that computing power of infinite computing. We cannot, and we have not been able to do that to date, simply because it is too much of an ask for the level of computing power that's needed. But again, do you think that will be possible if we've now shifted the game and going forwards you have access to an infinite amount of computing? So you end up with the best design optimized across all dimensions based on your constraints. Many of you will have seen, I think out there, or seen previously, this whole notion of 3D printing. Being able to shorten the notion of going from the abstract concept of a design to here's a physical object. Being able to do that very quickly rather than the traditional process of having to get a prototype made, etc., etc. At the small scale, a very useful way for communicating issues on construction with customers. Very good way for prototyping parts, for testing, and certainly being used for bespoke elements going into buildings. We're already seeing that. What does it mean on the larger scale, though? Do we foresee a time where things will be scaled up? Is this a game changer? I put it to you that yes, it is, because if you think about it, those of us that grew up in construction, what was the thing that was drummed into us? Economies of scale. You get a cheaper unit price by buying more of the same thing. Because complexity used to be expensive and uniqueness used to be expensive. But now, if looking forwards, we can go directly from an abstract 3D model into a physical object through something like 3D printing, you sidestep that whole issue of uniqueness and complexity being expensive. And they no longer are. What might the implications be for that for you as construction professionals? Reverse constructability, the notion that the phrase, if only, should disappear over the next 10 years. If only we'd orientated the building slightly differently so it didn't catch the radiation so much and people got burnt down on the sun deck. If only we'd designed it a bit better for carbon performance. If only we'd perhaps squeezed in an extra floor and we could have increased our revenue over the course of the next 20 years. If you've got a model that you can do anything with before you build it, and you think about the notion of building in that intelligence to check for those things, are we going to head towards this point in the not too distant future where you can build things right first time every time? As opposed to finding out afterwards, wow, that's really blocked the view of the ocean that I wish I had. Supply chain intelligence. How can things like artificial intelligence and decision support help us make better decisions about suppliers, about who we use? I guess this is a bit of a contentious issue with construction because we've always had, I speak as an ex-construction professional, the challenge of antagonistic supply chains, of underbidding and overbatting, of going for the variation order, etc., etc. How can you maybe get insight and intelligence into a whole raft of suppliers? So the whole notion of supply chain intelligence as opposed to supply chain management, to make better decisions about who you partner with, to get the cheapest product, the best performing product from the most reliable partner. To do that, again, takes a lot of insight, takes a lot of information, takes the ability to be able to churn that information. Printed components I touched on earlier. Are any of you running facilities around robotic creation of columns or any other prefabricated concrete elements? So you may want to see some of the stuff that's going on in Europe around that with robotic shuttering, etc. for production. It's really great, but I'll be honest, it's probably a cottage industry right now. So there's a lot of talk about off-site construction, on-site assembly, so the whole notion of prefabrication, bringing it to the job site and assembling it. Where's the supply going to come from? Ask yourself that. Does that open up opportunities for you to maybe set up as a supply base? Is that something you're going to look to outsource? And if you do, what does that mean for the IP? Can you set up potentially as a provider of column designs and license your IP to manufacturers who will make it and fulfill the order to companies that are building it? What might the implications be around that for the scaled-up issue of printed components? And our last two, this whole notion of the social phenomenon of everyone's more connected and social wisdom. How can you begin to leverage things like the whole Facebook and everything else to capture knowledge and embed that within your organization? Institutionalize it. Sidestep those issues around the erosion of talent, around the fact that that guy who's the rotating equipment expert has now left after 25 years and he's 30 years, he's collected his Rolex and he's gone. How can you begin to capture this and leverage it multiple times so that expertise is available freely around your organization and it's adding value? And probably my favorite, the whole notion of crowdsourcing. So how does that social phenomenon, which fits into that megatrend of data, social and technology, of crowdsourcing, potentially going to change the game? Well, where is the best knowledge in the world? If infinite computing is the ability to tap an unlimited ability to process information, then crowdsourcing is the human equivalent. The ability to tap unlimited human potential, human knowledge. The best knowledge. The best knowledge may well exist in your company, but what if it isn't? What if you want to need to tap some expertise that potentially exists outside your organization? Can you leverage the wisdom of the crowd? Those of you that follow things like the news with crowdsourcing may have heard about a bunch of gamers unraveled one of the protein structures for one of the HIV viruses, I think last year, which is something that the scientists have been struggling with for 20 years, but they put it onto a crowdsourcing website and they managed to do this within 3 weeks. So again, how can that potential of the crowd maybe help you in this notion of being able to solve problems much quicker? So shorter, deeper transactions. Flip that round, what does that mean for you as an opportunity? Can you be a provider of such specialist knowledge into the crowd, into the cloud, as a value-add service, as a way to evolve and maybe to take the lead as the industry changes? Okay, so I've talked about AEC and construction. We'll go back. These are the 4 megatrends that I've mentioned, and those are the 3 sub-trends under each one, which gives you a nice round dozen things. These are the dozen things that I am tracking here at Autodesk that I think are shaping the industry. You may have others. You may be well ahead of the curve. But if you were to say which are the most critical ones for construction today and for the next sort of 2 or 3 years, I'd probably say these ones in yellow are. So unsurprisingly, it's the 3 associated with what's going on with the economy, stupid, everywhere around the world. And it's this notion of how the project delivery process is being transformed through crowd, through social, through technology, through infinite computing, through the cloud going forwards. Certainly, when I'm speaking, I'm sitting down with construction executives around the world and talking to them about these topics. These are the ones that are resonating the most. Everything on here that you see, whether it's in yellow or white, is important. They all recognize that. But these are the ones that are overweight of each of these trends. Okay, some final thoughts. I'd probably sum up by saying we are in a fantastically interesting age. The next 10 years is going to see some phenomenal changes, whether they're driven by technology, which is what we're excited about, or whether they're driven by the fact that, take a look at the engineering news record, top 225 contractors. Already 5 of the top 10 are Chinese. What are the implications for your industry going forwards, for those of you that are outside of China? And what are the implications for China in terms of how those construction companies become more export-focused? Just 2 small things that are changing. What are the implications around materials, the whole volatility, around finance, etc.? Some of those are risks, but there are also some fantastic opportunities as the project delivery process changes in reaction to these. Opportunities that are generational in nature for you to grab and carve out some territory on. Okay, that's all I've got. Thank you very much for listening. I think we've got a few minutes left, about 3 or 4 minutes. If anyone's got any questions, I should add that this presentation will be uploaded within the next 24 hours, so those of you that want it, you can download it and get access to it. Okay, any questions? Or have I bored you all to death? Have you dozed off having had lunch? Great. Well, hopefully it's giving you some food for thought about things to maybe think about how the industry is going to change in reaction to the big picture of what's going on. Thanks for your time, and I'll give you the last 2 or 3 minutes back. Great.